Hello, you're back. You're back with some more Supercharged Mark II Ford Transit goodness. Well, I'm glad you're here. I got you a cup of tea. Today's episode, I'm going to upload you in a matrix style fashion with some supercharger knowledge. I'll explain, hopefully, a little bit of history. I've got some demos, very unusual, very unconventional, which will clear up some misconceptions, and you can see really where I'm going with this with a little bit more detail. In the meantime, a little promise. I've done some analysis on the internet, and pretty much I've got a guarantee for you. 23% of the time, superchargers never go wrong. I know you're thinking, what was more horrifying, the number of superchargers leaving their engines or the number of copyright infringements you've just conducted? And I think, well, do you know what? I might have you as a subscriber. I've got my mum. The rest, I suspect, might be bots or that strange bloke down the news agent. So high risk, high gain. Let's see if we can fly under the radar on that. Welcome back. If you've come back from episode 1, or if you're new, welcome. My name's Matt. I am building a supercharged Mark II Ford Transit. And in the first episode, as a reminder, I outlined the main aims, mainly using Ford parts, aiming for about 260 usable horsepower. And I'm going to try and get 18 miles per gallon. I watched that episode 1 back, watched myself, and it was commented on that I was a little bit defensive. I thought that what I was doing was going to be a bit Marmite. And do you know what? I was touched to see so much in the way of positive comments, and it spurred me on. So I am grateful for that, and it means a lot. Now, today's episode, I'm going to upload some supercharger knowledge into your head, give you a bit of background, bit of history. I've got some demonstrations for you, which are unconventional, but there's a hero of mine. Have I got the book? No. Keith Duckworth, one of the founding fathers of Cosworth, and he had this opinion that he couldn't stand people who regurgitated knowledge. So I'm going to try and explain things differently in a way that you've not seen before. If you hadn't already guessed, this is shed engineering. So I call this my workshop. It is in fact a single garage. There's not much space down the side in a single garage when you put a full transit in here. And this is my main work area. It's about 1 meter wide by about 3 meters, 3.5 meters. This is where the magic happens. So I've got limited tools. You probably argue limited skills as well. I don't deny that. I have definitely got a limited budget, which I enjoy working under a limited budget because imagination is a real asset. And so my philosophy really, I suppose, is improvise, adapt, overcome. So I will use that when I'm building stuff. But let's move on. Right then, you lovely people, the things I do for you. I'm going to call this the bin bag demonstration. I don't think you'll see this anywhere on YouTube, but I like to explain things differently. So the point of this is lots of people, including engineers, have got a misconception about the way these superchargers turn. So to interrupt myself just briefly, I think I know where this enduring misconception
comes from. If anyone's familiar with devices that have got two rotors which are used to ingest material, so wood chippers, or in this case a metal shredder, you can see essentially that the material being ingested, or it goes through the middle, the rotors turn towards each other, but that's not the case, as I'll show you.
The misconception is this, that they turn this way, air is ingested through the middle and squeezed out through the back. That's not the case, but I'm seeing it on YouTube quite a lot. You know, the engineering programs explaining blowers and superchargers. It's not quite right, and I'm hopefully going to prove it to you with this old blower and cunningly a bin bag. Look at that. So the bin bag is really crudely taped around the outlet, would be the underside of the supercharger, and this is the idea. So on the top I've got marked, you can see the arrow. So this is the way that the supercharger should go, clockwise. Most engines, the vast majority of engines turn clockwise when you view them from the front, and the supercharger will be the same. And clockwise, if you look at these pulleys, let me just put that on a stand there. Does that work? Yeah, okay, so clockwise relates to that. The air doesn't go in the middle, it skirts around the inside of the casing that way. So big shovels, big scoops, the air goes left and right as we're looking at it around the outside of the casing. Right, so just going to pause there to get a different viewpoint. Ta-da, different viewpoint. I realise when I'm holding the camera and I'm talking about superchargers, I shake. So I'll put you on a tripod there. Different viewpoint. So we're looking at the underside of the supercharger as it was. This is the outlet. This is a bin bag. It's all scrunched up and crudely taped to that outlet. There's going to be air leaks, but you know, so be it. Hopefully this will show. And if you remember, this is the way the supercharger should go. I've marked it at the top. Hopefully you can see the arrow. White mark there, so you can see a complete revolution. And watch what happens when I turn this rotor in the way that it should go, and contrary to what most people think. Okay, so I'll count the revolutions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, so I can go a little bit more. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So we've got a sphere. How big is that roughly? We're looking at about a sphere of about 50 by 50, and we can work out the volume of that. But that is the supercharger turning that way round in the way that I know it works, and most people think it's the opposite. So I've got something else to show you. All right, let me show you something after that bin bag demonstration. This is a bit mathsy, but stick with me. Even if you're not a maths person, you might enjoy this, right? So we've inflated crudely a bin bag with my RO34 supercharger, and that bin bag formed a sphere, and it's roughly 50 centimeters in diameter, right? So if you remember, radius is half diameter, so we can say that the radius of that sphere is 25 centimeters. Right, so volume of the sphere, this is going to take you right back to school, I know. Volume of the sphere is 4/3 pi r cubed. And if you're glazing over at pi, just remember it is just a number. It's 3.141, it goes on and on, but I only remember it at that. And if we do the calculation for this, to find the volume of air in that sphere that we've pumped in, you get 4/3 times your pi, which is the 3.14, times that cubed. Now, that cubed works out as 15,625. You plug all of that into a calculator, you get 65,438 cc, right? And that is simply 65 litres. So that bin bag with that radius, with that diameter, is roughly 65 litres in volume. Now, if you remember from that demonstration, I did 20 clean revolutions of the RO34. So 20 revolutions pumped in 65 litres of air. Right, and we can find out or get an idea of how many, how much volume each revolution is pumped in by dividing that number by that number. So each revolution is pumping in 65 divided by 20 will give you 3.2 litres of air. So remember, this one, you know so much more about Wade than most people, but this Wade supercharger is the RO34 because it pumps in, it's rated at 3.4 litres.
And also we're comparing it to the manufacturer's rating, which is probably going to be at its optimum speed. But even so, hopefully you can see that at slow speed, these Root superchargers are really good at shifting air.
So with a black bin bag and a little bit of maths, we've shown that this supercharger, despite being 70 years old or thereabouts, puts out or displaces roughly what it should. So 3.2 litres compared to 3.4 litres. I haven't done their calculations, but I reckon that's about 93%. What I would say though, and this is where I think most supercharger sort of projects go wrong, is don't get greedy with the boost. As soon as you start increasing the boost pressures and increasing the speed, the efficiency drops, volumetric efficiency drops right off. So my plan is to keep this at low pressure and relatively low speed, so that the supercharger itself is kept in its happy place. And that's where they perform really well. If you keep the boost pressures low, they're in the happy place. So when you start getting greedy, you start getting the law of diminishing returns, and they don't cope very well at all. So as far as max performance is concerned, really the Turbo Boys, I will say that now, even though I'm a supercharger fan, the Turbo Boys have definitely got the advantage. Superchargers, really, you've just got to think of them, they've got their own niche in providing low down torque. They can produce good numbers. It's all about how you put the package together and how you think about it. So for my next magic trick, let me show you, with the aid of some rolled up newspaper, why these don't directly compress air and why they're called positive displacement superchargers. Okay, so you now know that the supercharger goes that way and that the air goes left and right, and it's basically, think of them as big scoops. They're scooped, the air is scooped and sent around the inside of the case that direction.
I've paused myself because I've realised I missed a trick. Some of you may well prefer pints over litres. So look at it this way. The supercharger's got two rotors, and the rotors have lobes, which I'll arrow here, and the hollows, I don't even know what the technical name is, but let's call them troughs. They carry the air around the inside of the case. Each of the troughs on this supercharger will carry equivalent volume of a pint. Okay, so there are 3 troughs on each rotor. So every revolution, this supercharger will displace 6 pints of air. It would probably displace 6 pints of beer as well if you filled it up with that. But that's the idea.
Right, so what I want to do, let's see if I can put you on a tripod here. Does that work? Will you stay there? Okay, right. So if I put that little packet of newspaper in there, you can hopefully see that as I rotate it, it goes around the inside of the casing without getting crushed. And hopefully, as I continue to rotate it, it should pop out the bottom in an uncompressed state. Now I can keep doing this, and it does work. Because they don't compress air, they won't compress that tube. And that packet of air, if you imagine it as a packet of air, just gets dropped into the intake plenum. Now, that seems like a wondrous thing, but it's also part of the reason why these aren't very good when you start winding up the boost. air likes, as I'm sure you can understand, likes to go from a high pressure environment to a low pressure environment. So when it gets to the bottom of the supercharger, it finds itself crammed into the inlet plenum, doesn't like it, and so it naturally wants to get out. And what you get is you do get some carryback, so you get some air. Naturally, there's a small gap on the way back, and air does come up at higher boosts, come back up through to the intake, and you get this strange situation where, again, if you get greedy with the boost, you get hot air coming up into the intake and heating up the air that's going back in. And that's partly why you get this law of diminishing returns. The harder you push them, the more hot air you get coming. It's compressed hot air, isn't it? It's high pressure hot air coming back and heating up your intake. And you don't want hot air going in. It's not a good thing. So the compression is indirect, basically. It happens underneath the supercharger, and it's merely due to this machine just shoveling air in, or almost literally shoveling the air in with these big rotors. So you might be thinking, I still don't get why they're called positive displacement superchargers. I keep getting or mixing up the terms supercharger and blower. Let's just treat them as the same thing. So really, I suppose a better way of describing would be a positive fixed displacement. So the volume it displaces every rotation, in theory, doesn't change, whether you're turning it really slowly, at what I was doing, 1 per second, right up to, sort of 6,000 RPM. In reality, it does drop off, but that positive fixed displacement affects the way that supercharged engines put out the power, and I'll compare that in a minute. But if we think about at 6 pints a revolution, if you actually think about it, that's a phenomenal amount of air that these rotate. So at a low idle speed, or should I say high idle speed, let's go for 1,000 RPM. Yeah, this thing is shifting 58 litres of air a second. And to put that into perspective, a person, I've done a quick Google, an average human person only breathes in 0.12 litres of air per second. And if you divide one number by the other, you'll find that at 1,000 RPM, this will supply enough breathing air for 483 people. Now, you might be thinking, why have you done that? What a strange comparison. Well, it's not, because if we go back to the origins of where these things came from, they started off as cabin blowers. They were fitted to aircraft during World War II and through the 50s and 60s, and they supplied the cabin air. So something very, very similar to this, a Marshall supercharger, blower, would create cabin pressure. They'd be fixed to the side of the aircraft engine, and their only job was to provide that cabin air. So one of these would provide the air for a civilian airliner. There's some other, I think a particular mark of Spitfire had one, the Vulcan bomber. I'll do a quick fact check of myself and put some pictures up. And that leads us to the history of Wade. If you go to a classic car show, you'll often see these Wade superchargers fitted to Rover V8s and hot rods and such like. They've always got a plaque, and you can tell a lot about the plaque. The plaque is a little bit of history. So you can see the serial number, which I haven't deciphered yet, but you might be able to see just here, Wade Engineering, Brighton. And the Wade company came about from just after World War II. They started in 1947, and there were lots of aircraft basically being scrapped, and they had something very, very similar to this called a Marshall cabin blower fitted. An amazing, again, there's very similar, amazing bits of engineering that just go into the scrap pile, hundreds and thousands of them. And the founders of Wade thought, well, that's a waste. Let's exploit this. Let's try and push supercharging technology and adapt them for automotive use. So the Wade Engineering Company actually started in 1947 in
Gatwick, 1947 to 1955. So I think if you've got a Wade Engineering Gatwick, it's 47 to 55. If it's Brighton, it's made 1955 or after. Moving on to, I mentioned this earlier, how that fixed displacement affects the engine, the performance. So this is totally freehand, right? So just bear with me. I'm trying to, hopefully this will go right. Okay, so if we look at a dyno graph, and this is just super general, all right, but a super general dyno graph, let's say for a naturally aspirated engine, would go up, and then there'd be a sort of dip near the top where it just starts running out of breathing performance as well. If we look at a fixed displacement root supercharger, because it's producing that progressive and consistent supply of air, you essentially would see something like that. It just goes up in a linear fashion, and again, as the supercharger sort of loses breathing performance near the top end, you might in reality we will get something like that. Okay, so you get an increase. The difference between the lines is your increase in power, and the general trait is a nice consistent delivery of power and increases in almost every area. Now let's compare that to the turbo, boys and girls, and this is very classically, let's say a turbo intercooled system. The early ones, power delivery might be something like that, and with turbos at low speed you don't get hardly anything. I'm sure you've heard of turbo lag, but as the speed of the turbo increases, I'm pretty sure from memory, something like you can get turbo speeds of over 200,000 RPM. The boost that it delivers increases exponentially, and you see that mirrored in the power curve. So you might get something like that, right? So let's say that's turbo intercooled system, and this one is supercharged unintercooled like mine. And let's say there are two systems that are supplying boost at the same rate. Immediately you might be thinking, hang about, if that's 10 psi and the supercharger is 10 psi, why the difference? Well, it's because superchargers need energy. They drain power. I call it the supercharger tax. They need power from the engine to drive the supercharger, and that is represented by turbos generally being able to produce higher power at the same boost, and obviously the intercooler helps as well. But the graphs, comparison of graphs, will show us something else about the driving characteristics. So this is NA, wasn't it? NA. So we've got the black line as NA. Typically at low revs, the NA might actually have an advantage over the turbo. So that difference there, that shaded area, would be your difference. But then when the turbo comes onto boost, it goes up and it's away. But let's compare turbochargers and superchargers. Here we can see the real difference. And remember, this is just a general idea. There's so many exceptions, but this is just general traits of fixed displacement superchargers versus turbo. This area here is where a root supercharger is winning. All right, so we've got an increase in power. This area here is where the turbo is winning. All right, so the driving trait, let's say Traffic Light Grand Prix. Let's go for that documentary Fast and Furious, that last race, supercharged black Dodge gets out in front initially, and the Supra catches up more quickly towards the end. So that's the idea. However, things change, don't they? This might be a fair comparison from, let's say, late 80s, 90s, but technology increases. So one of the companies that really did an amazing job with root superchargers was a company called Eaton. And they really pushed the technology, making this old machine more efficient. And you might think with Wade's, well, it's a 60-year-old supercharger, it's got no relevance. Well, Eaton did an amazing job, and you will see the Eaton superchargers on so many cars, from the noughties, like the Mercedes, anything with a compressor on is a root supercharger. So Mercedes, Jaguar, sorry. I think there might be an Aston, yes, there was an Aston Martin, wasn't there? DB, the early one, inline 6, that was supercharged, but supercharged minis, etc. So Eaton did a really good job of improving this line, but turbo technology, and obviously things change, emission standards and efficiency becomes much better. Turbo technology has increased to such a state that actually they're coming on boost much earlier, and your line will be something like that probably, so you're winning all the way. You know that I like a bargain, right? I've always liked triple carbs on V6s, but I can't afford them, too expensive. So I've got these. Like I say, I wouldn't you think any less of me if I don't want to tell exactly where I got these from, but they were cheap, £80, and they are carburetors, but I'm not using them as carburetors. All right, I'm using them as just throttle bodies really, and to get them to work, I bought an old milling machine. I'll tell you the story about that milling machine. Milling machine, man maths, if you buy tools for a project, it doesn't count towards the budget. So the milling machine has been really useful, and I milled this plate up. I think it's 15mm thick, specifically to mount these carburetors, which I'm going to use as throttle bodies, because they just look freaking awesome on a diagonal, right? And that is what's mounted to this, like so. So I'm being greedy, I admit it. Look, it's my project. I like triple carbs, I like supercharged, and I thought I'm gonna have both of them, and that's what I've done. So the plate mounts to the top of the supercharger, and the other thing you might be wondering, these sort of, I call them winglets coming out here. Well, the supercharger, I wasn't quite happy with the way that the manufacturer mounts a supercharger, so I came up with this idea. So these rods, tie rods, go all the way through there, and will clamp down the supercharger in what I call a supercharger sandwich. So the tension force, as you wind them up, securely keep everything clamped down. So it's just the way I've decided to do things. I much prefer that than using the manufacturer's threaded holes underside, which would actually be bolts in the inlet plenum, which could vibrate loose and get ingested. I don't want that. I didn't like that idea. If I can avoid any bolts in the inlet plenum, yeah, I would do that, because I just don't want an M10 bolt going into the intake. Right, so we've got it looks fairly traditional, but let me take this supercharger off and show you what's underneath. Right, just in case you're wondering, supercharger, this one weighs about 20 kilos. Right, so I made this using my milling machine, and it's proper shed engineering, so just bear with me. But you can see the ports down into the engine here, 6 trumpets. And one thing to note is that on this way I've done it, the supercharger is mounted forward from the center line. Now, one thing that worries me about using a suck-through carburetor system is uneven fuel distribution through to the various cylinders. So if I had it mounted centrally, I think with carburetors, a suck-through system, the central cylinders would get more fuel than the ones to the front or to the rear. At the moment, now I've got the supercharger moved forward, so I don't have to cut away the bulkhead. But my concern then was that the front cylinders would get a greater share of the fuel, and the rear ones would be lean. And I think that's always a problem with suck-through carburetor systems. It's a compromise. You can do plug tuning, and you can put lambda sensors if you want in each runner, and you can put baffle plates in to divert the flow. But I thought, as much as I'm into classic cars, fuel injection is going to be the way to go. So at the back here, hidden away behind the supercharger, is the next indication of what's going on. We've got a manifold air pressure sensor, temperature sensor. We've got a bypass valve, and essentially this is going to be running fuel injection, a mappable fuel injection system. If you're wondering what this is a very old-fashioned way of dealing with manifold spikes in manifold pressure. So, for example, back pressure. If you remember that montage video, blowers literally blowing themselves off. This is simply a plate which allows a release of the pressure if there is one. I don't think I'll get one, but I've decided to put one in anyway. You can see the numbers here. I've got basically my kids were learning about Hooke's law at school, so we've got these, and I think the exhaust mounting springs. They measured the spring rate in the bathroom on scales for me, and we can preload the springs and vary the amount of pressure it takes to blow this off. Blow off is probably the wrong word. It shouldn't be used unless something goes wrong, but these springs need to be changed. That reminds me. So underneath this, we've got sensor deck at the back, like I say, with all of the necessary sensors. Underneath this, we've got that valley of vexation, but if you're sharp-eyed amongst you might notice we've got our fuel rail from the first episode anyway, the fuel rail mounted here. So fuel injectors will be injecting fuel into each port, and this is my secret to getting even fuel distribution. So I think the air pressure will equalise in that inlet plenum, but the fuel injection system with a fuel injector at each port would ensure as much as possible that I'm getting equal fuel to each cylinder, and more efficiently, because remember, one of my criteria is trying to get 18 miles per gallon. That might be wishful, but I've at least got to give it a fighting chance. Right, I mentioned a bypass valve. If you're not quite sure what it is, it's this. Right, so hopefully you can see it is just a valve that opens up like so, and it's operated by a vacuum. So that's a diaphragm. I'll show you by sucking it off. Watch this. Now, I bet you didn't think you'd click on YouTube. That's going to be a difficult one to explain, to watch a grown man sucking off a blow-off valve. But there you go. So it operates on vacuum, and so this bypass valve goes here, and it's another secret weapon I've got to improve the efficiency of this inefficient system. So superchargers here, the bypass valve is fitted here, and essentially it works like this. When the throttle bodies are closed, a vacuum is generated in the intake system. Let me just put it together and I'll show you. So this is all mock assembled, so you can hopefully see what my grand plan is. This is one of my secret ways to improving the efficiency. So this is assembled, triple throttle bodies, keep calling them carbs, the supercharger, the inlet plenum, which is just if you like an air bath, and the bypass valve from the Mini, is it R53, the supercharged one, and this is fitted in the sensor deck hidden behind. So this is all the magic happening behind the supercharger, and this is how I'm planning it will improve my efficiency. So supercharger is an air pump driven from the engine. It requires energy to do so. The more you compress the air, the more energy it requires. But there's certain situations where we don't need that supercharger, and for that, let's give you an example. Sitting in traffic, I don't need this to be pumping. I don't need the draw, the drain, and the increased fuel consumption from driving a supercharger. Sitting in traffic, very low speeds. When those butterflies and the throttles are closed, I don't need the supercharger. This is the plan. When the throttles are closed, the supercharger naturally is still pulling away at air, and as it does so, when the throttles are closed, those butterflies are in that position, a vacuum is generated here underneath the plate. Now I need to tap in a line, a vacuum line, and feed it to the bypass valve, so that at those sort of heavy traffic environments, the vacuum is created and it opens up that bypass valve. So let's have a look if we can. Yeah, so it opens it up like that, and that allows the supercharger, essentially, it's no longer compressing, it's just freewheeling. The air is just recirculated, which sounds bad, but it's not, because essentially, because the supercharger is not compressing air anymore and just freewheeling, the pumping losses are greatly reduced. So that's one of my plans, and with greatly reduced pumping losses, so while it's sitting in traffic, if it's not compressing, it's going to stay cooler for when you do need it. And a lot of my thoughts are into reducing the temperatures, the intake temperatures, and this is one of the things. Bypass valve from Mini, I think it's R53, is it the supercharged one? That's the plan anyway. One thing that might have occurred to you, last time I called this a Hoofing Great supercharger. Compared to some of the American ones, it's a small one. But you might have realised that, well, that's rated at 3.4 litres and the engine's 2.9 litres. That doesn't sound like much bigger, Matt. And this comes on to another misconception. So understand this. This is a 2.9 litre engine, and all engines, to displace their specified volume, have to rotate twice, because it's a 4-stroke system, isn't it? Suck, squeeze, bang, blow. That piston has to, and that crank has to rotate twice to displace its specified volume. So to get the 2.9 litres, we get 2 revolutions of the crankshaft. If we get 2 revolutions of the crankshaft and the supercharger is also on a 1-to-1 drive and revolves twice, that means it displaces 2 times 3.4. So we've got a 2.9 engine with a supercharger trying to cram 6.8 litres down its throat. Hopefully from that you'll realise, oh, that, yeah, I can see the problem there. That something needs to change. So the change is this. I'm not blindly putting a 1-to-1 drive pulley system like a lot of people do and hope for the best. Done the calculations and I've down geared it. So this supercharger is running about 2/3 speed. That means that if the engine's at 6,000 RPM, supercharger's at 4,000 RPM. And that will give me my low boost that I'm looking for. The other advantage is lower heat. So I'm hoping for much lower intake temperatures. I have achieved the down gearing. If you look, there's actually 3 belts here. Ignore this belt, that's the alternator belt. But 1 belt here going to the water pump. And you've got another belt here, the tooth one, going to the supercharger. And if you look at the size of these pulleys, I've got one stacked on the other on the water pump. You might see that actually I'm using the water pump as an intermediary to down gear it to get this. I think it's 67% gear ratio from there to there. The criticism I had before is that the water pump, the bearings won't be able to cope with the torque of the engine. And let me just bring that in there, so hopefully you can see. So the criticism I've had is that the water pump, the bearings won't be able to keep up with the torque of the engine. Supercharged engine, the water pump bearings won't be able to deal with the torque. My argument to that is, if a bearing has to cope with the torque of an engine, that bearing has ceased. The bearing has to cope with 2 things really, predominantly: speed and load, i.e. the load on the bearing, but not the torque. If it has to deal with torque, it's ceased. So I've got 2 equal and opposite forces basically on this system. You've got this belt pulling that pulley down from the water pump, and you've got this belt pulling the pulley up. And the idea here is actually that the forces on the bearing, equal and opposite forces, will cancel each other out. I hope, and I'm going to carry a spare water pump anyway, but I hope that the bearings on this water pump will be under less stress in this application than they would be in their original Ford Granada application, where you've got a whole clutter of things here. I think alternator, air conditioning pump, power steering, and you've got one primary force on the water pump pulling that way. This one, equal and opposite forces to cancel each other out. You finished with that? Well done. Yeah, I'll take it. I do make a good brew, if I do say so myself. Well done for getting through to the end. While other people were watching things like cats playing pianos or violins, you were watching a middle-aged man do unspeakable things to a bypass valve. So that in its own is very niche. I've broadened your horizons. I'm sure that'll be a difficult thing to explain to your partner on your Google history, and you can thank me for that or blame me, whichever is the case. Next episodes are going to be much more, I think, hands-on, so you'll get to see some of the things I'm building, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Bye-bye.
We're so beautiful, don't wanna lose this feeling.